you for attending another episode of the ClinEdge webinar series. My name is Simone, and I'll be your moderator today. For those of you who are new, we host webinars each month, partnering with experts in the industry. I welcome you to our very first episode of 2018. In each episode, we strive to cover various topics of clinical research, including but not limited to operations and optimization, patient recruitment and retention, financial services, technology, and more. We invite and encourage experts from sponsor CROs, site vendors, and health professionals to present in our webinar series to help promote learning, idea exchange, and progress. Our mission is to spread inspiration for clinical professionals by clinical professionals. We'd really like to hear from you and would like to include your voice in the conversation. So ask questions, share comments, even challenge our ideas. Use the question and answer panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar sidebar to share at any time during the webinar. We'll also have a few poll questions. Those will pop up right on your screen, but more about this later. Today's presentation is called The Ultimate Guide to Breaking a Novice PI into Clinical Research. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Chris Matteo. Chris Matteo is the Associate Director of Clinical Operations at ClinEdge. He holds a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Boston College and has exclusively worked in the clinical research industry. He works to facilitate the study startup processes between sites and sponsor CROs to expedite site selection timelines. Chris provides personalized business development to a network of elite clinical research sites working to broaden their clinical research pipeline in various therapeutic areas. So once again, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit your questions at any time in the box in the right side panel of your screen. There will be about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. I'll be asking questions out loud at that time. Any questions not addressed may be answered in a follow-up blog post. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Chris to begin.
Thanks, Simone, and thanks everybody for joining today. Simone mentioned I've worked with sites and kind of serve as a liaison between the sites, our site clients that I work with, and sponsor CROs, really facilitating the CDA and FQ completion process, that site identification period, ensuring our sites get awards. And with that, I have worked with a lot of experienced sites, a lot of inexperienced sites trying to break into new therapeutic areas, and particularly a few PIs I worked with that are trying to break their novice PIs into clinical research. So moving on, I actually wanted to start with a quick poll. Simone, if you want to run the first poll, just to see what type of organization everyone's checking in from, help gear my presentation to the best of our audience, and just going forward, just wanted to get an idea of that. So just let a few of those come in. See how that's going. Just waiting for a few more responses. See if you're coming from a site, sponsor CRO, or like a health institute, whether privately owned research site, or if you guys are from somewhere else. Okay, so okay. All right, great. So moving on, these are kind of be our learning topics, if you will. The few things that hopefully you guys bring as takeaways are from these 3 points mainly. The first one being leveraging your overall site experience in the most strategic way to get a novice PI's foot in the door. So in this one, I'm briefly going to talk about the process of adding a new investigator, kind of the steps you can take to use your site experience to, eventually start them off as a sub-I and eventually start that process of introducing that PI to research, eventually them becoming the PI on a study. The second point, which will kind of piggyback off the site experience, is using your site experience and how you can optimize your feasibility questionnaire completion and maximize the chance of getting an award. Here we'll really go over in detail a few examples, some things to avoid, and some areas that you want to try and improve your feasibility questionnaire completion, especially if you're trying to break a research-naive PI into clinical research. And then we'll round out our discussion with deciding what should and shouldn't be your first study. We'll have a case study showcasing one of our inexperienced PIs, the study they took in order to build that CV and get into research. So I did want to cover the two barriers that you're going to see for research when you're trying to secure that first study. That first barrier that you're always going to see is the lack of clinical trial experience on the CV. It's something that often sponsors or CROs will reach out for when they ask you for a PI submission. They often want to see that CV. I've even seen some CVs be turned away because they don't have clinical research on it. So, they really want to see the trial experience on those CVs. That's why they're asking for it. So that's going to be our first hurdle in getting a new study. The second would be just feasibility questionnaire completion as a whole. Number one issue you're going to run into here is this prior metrics question, or prior studies completed in the indication that they're reaching out for. So you're going to see a box similar to the one below. It's always kind of referring to the study indication, obviously of the study that you're reaching out for. It's going to want to know your enrollment numbers. They want to see that you exceeded enrollment or met enrollment goals. And there's that question. They want to see that you met the enrollment requirement. And they also want to see the enrollment period, whether or not it was competitive, to see if you were able to exceed that enrollment. So we're going to cover our first topic, how to leverage overall site experience. And so adding a new investigator, again, going to go over briefly a process you can take to add a new investigator to your site. First question you're probably going to ask yourself is, why do sites want to add a new PI? There's many different reasons. One of them being maybe they're adapting to industry trends. They're seeing a couple studies come in from their sponsors or CROs. Maybe they're seeing a lot of GI work come up. Maybe they want to get into that area, something like that. Another reason is, adding a new PI from a nearby location. That's a new referral source that you can use for your other studies, for your other physicians. They can draw from that potential patient pool now. Alternatively, maybe you already have the patient population in your practice and you want to exploit that. Maybe you're seeing an unmet need in your patients. A lot of them have, NASH. A lot of them have UC and Crohn's. You want to really exploit that patient practice, but you don't have the PI or the investigator that can necessarily do those procedures. So you want to try and find, a physician that can do that and, really take advantage of that patient pool that's missing, that gap. So in terms of the process of adding a new investigator, one thing I recommend is creating a focused presentation and hosting a lunch and learn. And ideally, you would invite multiple physicians of the same specialty, just so you can have a really targeted presentation towards their therapeutic area. In that presentation, start with the basics, go over your clinical trial background, the types of trials you've done, your therapeutic expertise, maybe some industry trends that you're seeing, why you're inviting them to your site to, potentially vet them. What you're doing is you're vetting the sites and hoping this sparks a conversation between you and the potential investigator about research, see if they're interested in joining your organization. This is kind of the initial step. In that, you can give some details of your research staff, the coordinators that you have, maybe certain raters you have, maybe your coordinator has experience in their therapeutic area, maybe they worked at a prior site, show that we are bringing a little experience, maybe you've worked in similar indications to their therapeutic area, something you want to bring up. It doesn't hurt to mention pharma clients. I'm sure most doctors know certain contacts that they have at these larger pharmaceutical companies. Everyone's heard of Janssen. Everyone's heard of Johnson & Johnson. Maybe you've done a few trials with them. It doesn't hurt to bring that up as well. Example of a study budget, also a good thing to display during this presentation. They kind of get an idea of how much each procedure costs, seeing where the PI, the sub-I comes in, seeing where the coordinators, where their roles fit, just by looking at these different procedures and the amount of money that is paid per patient per site. So another big topic would be the PI expectations and compensation structure. I'm not going to go into too much details here, just as a little disclaimer. I could probably do a whole webinar on this on its own. But that being said, if you did want to, at the end, there's an option. You can send an email, put in a question for us to answer later. I'd be happy to take a look at it. We have a few example contracts that we have. And then, something they might be most excited about would be this, these innovative treatments in their pipelines. This, with the point of having multiple physicians of the same specialty is that, maybe you have seen a couple innovative drugs in their area. You want to share with them, show them what a couple of the big names are working on. Maybe there's a couple competing studies that people are working on. And, like right now, uterine fibroids and women's health, there was a couple different sponsors were working on different drugs, different approaches to that. There's a bunch of different sources for this, other than CROs and sponsors reaching out to you. News articles or news outlets such as Business Wire, Fierce Biotech, stuff like that, all information you can pull these innovative treatments from. So when a new PI joins, first thing you want to do is outlay expectations and what research entails. You're going to want to let them know that there's going to be consistent meetings with the doctor and staff members of the clinic. One question that probably always will come up from a new PI is, are you HIPAA compliant with regards with access to their database? Best thing to do there is just show them your SOPs. I'm sure they'll be pretty impressed by the extensive details that go into the HIPAA compliance. And one thing you definitely want to take into consideration is when choosing the right protocols and feasibilities to review with this new PI. You got to be strategic. If you're coming from an experienced site, you've worked in industry a while, you know that delays are inevitable, especially a pre-award study. It could be a year or two before that ends up turning into fruition. It might not even happen at all. You don't want a PI to review this protocol, feasibility, get super excited, and the trial ends up not moving forward at all. So something to keep in mind, it's not saying you shouldn't show your feasibilities and protocols to the PI if you have a specific question about it. Definitely worth sharing with them, seeing if they think they can do the procedure. But yeah, just like circling back, make sure they understand when they join that there are inevitable delays with sponsor. It could be anything. It could be FDA, discussions with the FDA, their protocol amendment, waiting for funding. There's a multitude of different issues that can come up when starting to conduct a study. Next thing, when you have this novice PI join, it's a good idea to have this 3 to 6 month pilot period to build up their CV. This and ensure they try and come in at least 3 to 5 hours per week on site. And once you do that, a good filler for this during this pilot period is to utilize the investigator, this research naive PI that potentially join your team as a sub-I. So we'll just briefly discuss that now. So, this is looping back to utilizing your experienced PIs, your experienced site, and getting them to serve as a sub-I. It's obviously going to be easier for your PI to get a clinical trial. They have experience, their feasibilities look better, they may have past metrics, and it doesn't hurt to put them in the sub-I role during this trial period, this 3 to 6 month pilot period. It familiarizes them with the research process. You also get to see how they handle research, how they approach it. It's more of a precursor to how they're going to serve as a PI. And, you got to think about your site's reputation of this. Adding a novice PI to your site, it's an extension of your site. You should never think of it as, oh, I need this PI for my business model to work. They serve as an extension of your site. So when you're thinking of taking on this first study, definitely think easier. You don't want to have them work on some ridiculously intensive, inpatient, overnight study, and it might scare them away from research. But then again, think of your site's reputation, because they're going to be reflecting on your site to the sponsor and CRO world as well. So once this pilot period is over, and our ultimate goal here is to get this research naive investigator to serve as a PI. Again, this is going to heavily involve utilizing your site experience. Those big speed bumps you're going to run into are the lack of clinical trial experience on the CV, as well as completing those feasibility questionnaires, not having the metrics to provide, or the prior experience. So, you really got to use your PI, your current site PIs, your current site sub-Is, even your coordinators. Again, circling back to the fact that maybe a coordinator worked at a previous clinical trial site that was in the therapeutic area of the potential new investigator joining your site, this naive investigator, and also any raters you may have access to. Again, might go without saying, but leverage your existing CRO and sponsor relationships. You have maybe a few good relationships with your monitors. See if they're working on any trials that fit the PI's therapeutic area. Maybe there's one that would be he could be a good sub-I roll in, but really use their sponsor and CRO relationships, see if there's something out there for them. And another key important thing to keep in mind is the expectations of the sponsor and CRO. When you're reviewing a potential study, really understand the patient profile, what the procedures are involved, what is the the study contact, what's the study lead asking for. Make sure that you're kind of evaluating if the research naive PI would best be suited as sub-I or PI, depending on the procedures, the patient profiles, and the expectations of the sponsor and CRO. Okay. Before we get into our next topic, I'm going to run the second poll. Simone, if you don't mind sending that up. Just curious to see if any of you have experience introducing a research naive investigator into research securing that first study. Seeing if, maybe you have used similar strategies that are coming up, if any of these look familiar, or if, potentially this could be some really good learning topics for you. So we'll just let these come in.
Yeah, I know we had a few new people just join, so we have a few polls running, and all you have to do is, when you see them on the screen, just select your answer, and that's pretty much it. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds.
Okay, great. Looks like a fair amount of experience. Some of you looking to potentially maybe add a new PI to your site or want to learn more about it. So our second topic would be this optimizing feasibility completion strategies, maximizing the chance of getting an award. So again, the number one issue here is we're going to run into, for your research naive investigator, is going to be all these inquiries about the PI experience. So the first piece of advice I want to give is, with lack of experience, you're really going to want to stress your database, recruitment from your private practice, your research naive private practice, an established referral source that you have, and I would, advertising is less preferable. You want to have that on the lower side when completing these feasibility questionnaires. If you think about it from a cost perspective and a patient perspective, this is preferable to the sponsor. On the cost side, the sponsor isn't going to want to spend a lot of time getting a site up and running. They don't want to keep that enrollment period up longer than it should be. They want to get in patients as quickly as possible. Sites that use less advertising are going to be able to do that a little bit easier. From a patient side, if you think about it, patients are going to trust the doctor that they're going to. They're going to prefer, it'll be more likely to enter a clinical research study if they're using the PI, their physician that they've been with for a while. However, with that being said, I understand there are some studies out there where advertising might be a little bit more necessary. So for those ones, you just got to understand the market, understand that the therapeutic area, that these types of studies will require more advertising. The sponsor should know that, CRO should know that, the study team should know that. How you find that out, maybe you just know it's a rare indication. Friends in the industry that have worked on that trial, or you've done similar trials, it's kind of a tougher indication, is going to need advertising. So my second piece of advice would be utilizing the comments section. to describe site experience. Really stressing the site experience because that investigator experience is absent. So you're really going to want to put that in wherever you can. Kind of leading into my next points of don't leave any questions blank ever. Always fill out the comment section. Make sure to answer anything about the eligibility criteria, and go above and beyond. Our ultimate goal here when completing a feasibility is to establish clear expectations about what your site can offer. And at the same time, it opens this honest dialogue between your team and the sponsor, so the sponsor knows what to expect from you. And another piece of advice would be very quick when turning around the feasibility. Sponsors going to prefer sites that are, I might go without saying, but returning feasibilities in a timely manner shows that they'll be quick on any other requests that are made by the sponsor or CRO. Maybe it's an insight to how recruitment and enrollment will go, that you're very quick and you'll be on your game. However, if that being said, if you do, for whatever reason, if you're unable to get back a feasibility in the allotted time frame, say they wanted it back in 2 days, but the PI is on vacation, you absolutely need to hear back from him, or maybe he's on call at the hospital. It really depends. Just make sure you communicate that to the person who's collecting the feasibilities, the lead project manager, that you're going to expect delays. Give them a reason why, and let them know you'll get them back to it as soon as you can. Okay, so we're just going to run over a few examples and strategies here, kind of compare the good and the bad, some things that we've seen before, some common issues that come up, and ways to avoid them, especially if you're trying to push that inexperienced PI, you're really going to want to avoid some of these things. So this first part, you're pretty much always going to see this on a feasibility questionnaire. It's going to ask what percentage of patients come from database, referrals, how much you would need from advertising, and any other sources if you have them. So if you notice here, database might be a little low, 40%, and that advertising looks a little high. For sake of example, we're going to use osteoarthritis, OA of the knee, as for all examples going forward. Historically, one of those types of trials that doesn't need that much advertising, pretty prominent in site databases. And the second question, it's asking if you have any referral sources. They have that 20% up there, but in the second question, they just put, we have a strong referral network. That doesn't really do a whole lot. That's just basically saying the same thing as 20%. That's a strong number for a referral network. It's not doing anything. It's not doing you or the sponsor any good, giving you any insight to the site. And this comment section they left blank, which is definitely a no-no. We don't want that. Okay, so this would look a little better. This would look a little bit more appealing to the sponsor's eyes, kind of the ideal answers to this type of question in regards to your patient population. So you notice initially on that first question, the database is immediately higher, 70%, and the referrals stay about the same, but they reduce that advertising. This should be what most sites that are experienced would put out these numbers. This is pretty typical. The higher database, some referrals, and lower advertising. And if they do ask you to explain advertising, just mention, maybe give a success story in the past of your site from, obviously you're not going to be able to give an explanation for an OA of the knee trial because you've never done one. You're trying to break this research naive investigator into this indication. So maybe in something similar, if you've done a back pain trial, migraine trial, just something in the pain realm, anything like that, you could, if you need to explain your advertising, maybe give a success story, explain how it's worked in the past. You notice the second question is asking about the referrals again, and they went into a little more detail here. They said instead of saying we have a strong network, they said we have 3 orthopedic physician practices in our area that refer patients to our site for the last 7 years. We've received an average of 100 patient referrals per month with OA of the knee. So you give a little bit more detail, a little bit more meat to that answer. You kind of understand what's going on, and a little more insight and specifics, giving specifics, which is important. And in this comment section, previously was left blank. In the first question, I didn't really leave any area to explain the database. And, with a research naive investigator, they're probably going to not want to just take your word for it that you're going to recruit mostly from the database. You want to give maybe a little bit more answers if you can. Here they're like, the doctor has access to 4,500 patients in their database, with OA of the knee and treating 1,300 patients currently, and Dr. X sees 5 new patients a week with OA of the knee. Again, just giving more insight into your access to the database, access to patients with OA of the knee, just being as detailed as possible. Okay. Here's another question that always comes up. Again, mentioned as one of our barriers is going to be these prior metrics. In the top question, asking if your research naive investigators conduct prior OA studies. Not a whole lot you can do there. 0. It's going to stay same for the both of them. But something to be cognizant of when you're completing these feasibilities is see if there's sometimes these aren't just numerical inputs. Sometimes they allow for free responses. If the feasibility is a Word document, sometimes even the online feasibility questionnaires are not filled in. They're not numerical, so you can do free responses. Maybe put a little bit more information in there, like 0 trials, but we'll show an example later. But give a little bit of explanation as to why you complete the trial successfully. And then in the second part, it's asking about the metrics. They didn't put any. Obviously, they won't have any OA of the knee trial experience. But if you notice, they may have not been paying attention. But if your site, it says there, if your site has no OA experience, please list related pain clinical trial experience. So maybe they should have put some more information in there. So we'll see an example in a sec. And then the last question on this would be, based on eligibility criteria and the protocol, can you describe your ability to successfully enroll for this opportunity? You notice they're just like, we have access to the patient's described eligibility criteria and we'll be able to successfully enroll for this trial. That, again, doesn't really tell the sponsor, CRO, anything. It's just telling you, I'm completing, it's basically that you're completing the feasibility questionnaire because you have access to patients. It's not really doing anybody a whole lot of good there. So this would be a little better example. Top part, has the PI conducted any prior OA studies? 0, if this is a free response answer, mention the similar trials that you've done, assuming maybe this research naive investigator is a rheumatologist, maybe your internal med doc has worked on a couple of these other studies, or a neurologist has done these other studies at your site. So you want to make sure to list those similar pain indications that you've done. Maybe there's some overlapping features in each study. The metrics here, they put in a few metrics from prior studies they've done, including the chronic lower back pain, fibromyalgia, migraine, just a couple studies in the pain realm. Make sure to fill that out. And then the last question, based on the eligibility criteria of the protocol, can you describe your ability to successfully enroll for this opportunity? In this one, you notice in their response, they put something that was specific to the protocol, this WOMAC pain scale, and specifically relating to their patient population. So they said, more than half of our patients we see with OA of the pain in the knee meet this grade 4 WOMAC pain scale based on our historical data. Dr. X is comfortable with the WOMAC scale. She routinely uses it in her private practice. We are confident meeting 25 patients in 4 weeks will be very attainable. So you see here, maybe there was a point in the protocol that had recruitment expectations that they wanted to see each site recruit 25 patients in 4 weeks. So they made sure to throw that in there as well, just proving they read the protocol and that they're really invested in this study, learning more about it. Okay, pretty much at the end of every feasibility questionnaire, you're going to see a question similar to this. It's going to be basically, and is there any additional information you want the sponsor or CRO to know for your consideration? First bad answer would be, we are very excited about this opportunity. Doesn't really tell the sponsor a whole lot about your site. I'm sure a lot of people are excited about this opportunity. A lot of people are completing the feasibility questionnaires. again, not a whole lot you're telling them there. In the second question, the second part, the one that looks a little better, perhaps a better answer, I would even consider getting rid of that first line. Although our PDI is not a specific clinical trial experience, you can maybe get rid of that part, but you could mention that, in here they mentioned they have previously conducted pain studies. In this chronic lower back pain trial they did, they were a rescue site, they exceeded enrollment, and they were the top enroller. And also they, if there wasn't a place for to put it earlier, which often there might not be, you can mention your coordinator experience. In this instance, they mentioned the coordinators have done over 30 studies in prior in pain-related studies. 3 of these studies were in OA of the knee, perhaps at a previous site they worked at. And then, again, doesn't hurt to mention, this is a research-naive PI, so you can mention that they're going to be able to devote their full attention and resources to opportunity. And then at the end, just reaffirming that they can enroll for this study. Okay, so in terms of follow-up after the feasibility questionnaire is complete, there's a few things you can do. One of the main questions we get is how often should I be following up with a sponsor or CRO after I submit a feasibility questionnaire? Like with all studies, it's going to be unique depending on the scenario, mainly surrounding around timelines. So if a study is adding sites right now, you might want to be a little bit more aggressive in your follow-up, reaching out every couple of days or so. If it's a pre-award study, I would check in every couple months to see where the trial stands. Plus, CROs normally notify you if they've been awarded a trial, or if they, or if it's they haven't been awarded, they'll say thanks for your input, but we weren't unfortunately not awarded. And if you have no timelines, if they don't give you any timelines, you just submit a feasibility questionnaire, you don't know when it's starting, I would say a safe bet's every 2 weeks until you get an answer, really trying to find out what those timelines are. Other things you can do are submitting one-sheets. Maybe it could be about the therapeutic area of the research-naive PI, but if you don't have a lot of data there, you can just show prior site experience on that one sheet. Maybe you have a site one sheet that you have on file. Doesn't hurt to submit that. In your follow-up, you always want to you want to try and make sure to reconfirm your interest in the study, your access to the patient population, and maybe touch on the prior staff experience if you have it. And again, like the personalized email that pulls out synopsis information, this is probably going to be more effective against a sponsor. Sponsors love to hear their drugs named and outreach emails there, when you're checking on them. They've been working on this drug for a long time. They probably want to hear it mentioned instead of just an OA study you mentioned. It's their specific drug. Okay. So now we're just going to hop into our last topic here, which is deciding what should and should not be your first study. I did want to point out here, before we dive into this, that relationships between sites and CROs or sponsors are very important. They have pretty extensive databases, sponsor CROs. They tend to remember how sites did on prior trials. So you don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. You want to try and avoid that. Again, circling back to the feasibility questionnaire, it's supposed to be like an honest dialogue with a sponsor, outlining exactly what they can expect from you. So you want to be careful that you don't want to take on an incredibly hard study for a PI, for a research-naive PI that's going to be very difficult for the PI to do, and they could have trouble with that and maybe not perform the best. So, again, thinking about easier studies for this one. And, if you do well with a sponsor, if you exceed your expectations that were initially laid out, there's often repeat business there. They'll come back to you. Maybe you'll get listed as preferred site. They'll enter you into your database, and you'll get reached out to for future studies, maybe for your research-naive investigator or even your other investigators at your site. They'll just check with you. Another quick note before we go into the types of studies you should look at. When you're deciding interest on a study, don't let certain things steer you away. And some of those things would be certain equipment. say the study requires an MRI machine that you don't have, but they don't say anything about it. They don't say it's like necessary, it's absolutely required. Sometimes the sponsor will pay for that equipment if you ask them, or they'll allow you to outsource it to a nearby location. Maybe you have a nearby physician that can help you that has this equipment, nearby physician's office that has this. You could also purchase the equipment. It could be useful for you down the line. And again, same thing that goes with staff. If you're missing a certain staff member that they're asking for the study, you can always contract that out. See that a lot here with raters when they're asking for raters with specific experience in certain scales. Sometimes you can contract that out. So don't let that steer away from you either when you're deciding interest in a study. Okay, and before we jump into this, Simone, I wanted to run the last poll, if you don't mind putting that up, and send that in. It's just, we're going to be talking about observational and phase 4 studies. Just wanted to see if any of you have participated in one before, so you know what's expected of them, kind of know what how they're different from phase 1 to 3. In terms of compensation, study design, kind of the recruitment period. Just wanted to see if anyone's done a couple of these before, or maybe even just one. That would be fine. Okay. All right, I see. Got it. So a lot of you have done this before, so you know what to expect. These are typically experienced sites will turn these away. Reason being for that is the pay is not as great. Sometimes it takes away from patient population and other studies. They're worried about that. Don't want to take these. But with a research naive investigator, these are often great outlets into stepping your foot into clinical research, getting your first study, getting your foot in the door. When sponsors and CROs reach out for these studies, they're typically less concerned with your prior experience. They're more looking for sites that want to take these on, looking for sites that have access to this patient population. So that becomes very important here. So these are we've seen a couple times where PIs have taken these studies, and it's been kind of a stepping stone into other clinical trials. It allows you to build your CV, allows you to put down prior metrics, show that you were the PI on study, maybe you over-enrolled what was expected. So it's a great CV builder, great resume builder, show that past trial experience. And in fact, we've seen that phase 4 studies have actually increased over the last couple of years, and they make up 16% of the projects in clinical phases right now. So the studies are out there, and you can, they're definitely, if you're trying to break a research naive PI, and it'd be great to get them an interventional study, but this is one thing to think of when you're doing that. And also, it has this alternate effect with any study you work on. Builds relationships with the sponsors and CROs. Maybe they'll add you for other interventional programs. Could be helpful. So now we're just going to go over a quick case study of what we've seen in an experienced PI we've worked with in the past, pretty recently. So they're struggling to find, get their foot in the door in the research, and they decided to take on this phase 4 postoperative pain study with a sponsor. They're very quick in their feasibility turnaround time. Generally, overall, pretty good at communication. They had the patient population. They were, contracted to enroll 15 patients, ended up enrolling 20. Sponsor was very impressed with how quickly they got started up, how well they enrolled. They actually invited them to this phase 2 interventional DPN study that they had. It was ongoing. And so, this kind of essentially, it overcame our barrier of it's building the sites, the PI CV, this research naive PI CV. He's now got 2 trials under his belt in the pain world and the diabetes therapeutic area, and he's got the sponsor relationship. And recently talking to his site, know that they were a preferred site with the sponsor now, and they also recently landed a diabetes trial with a separate sponsor, just utilizing that they've worked with diabetes in the past in the DPN trial. They've had a little diabetes experience. So before I finish up here, just wanted to do a quick recap. It's kind of just go over the learning topics we learned. It's the leveraging overall site experience in the most strategic way to get your PI's foot in the door. Really consider the trial period, the pilot period, where you use them as a sub-I, and then eventually we'll transition them to PI. Still in that transition to PI, you want to utilize your site experience, and that comes into play on feasibility questionnaires. Just making sure to stress your database. If you have a strong referral source, make sure to give explicit details of that. And try and keep advertising on the low end unless historically it's an indication that needs higher advertising. Just make sure to explain that. And if you do have a high rate of advertising, explain how it's been successful in the past for you. And then in terms of deciding what to take on as your first study, keep in mind what the expectations are of the sponsor, what the study team, what the project manager wants. Make sure you're putting forward the correct PI. Make sure that the PI, your research naive PI, can do the procedures involved. If not, maybe consider putting them as a sub-I. And one thing to think about is the phase 4 studies, the observational studies. Those tend to be a little bit easier to secure, but it allows you to build your CV and these relationships with sponsors and CROs, particularly with the research naive PI. And so that is pretty much it. I just wanted to open it up to questions now. If anybody had any?
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you, Chris, for your very informative presentation. We now have time for some questions, as Chris mentioned. We did get some throughout, and we did get some before, so we're going to do our best to go through as many as we can. But for those of you who have a question and maybe don't know where to submit, you can submit your questions in the box on the right. So this one came in a little bit earlier. Chris, on the CV, do you recommend listing each study they have been involved in, or just list PI as another work activity?
Yeah, so if you're referring to, if it's a research naive PI and you're referring to each study they've been involved in, definitely seen people list their experience as a sub-I on the CV. It doesn't hurt to put that there. I've seen, some PIs put publications they've worked on, other studies, not specifically clinical research, just maybe lectures they've worked on or certain papers they've worked on. That also helps show that they're involved in, you're involved in research to some capacity. Experienced PIs, obviously you want to, anytime you have a study that's completed, or if you're working on one, definitely make sure to put that on your CV as well.
Okay, great. Question number 2. How can I explain our site adequately when the questionnaire doesn't offer a comment section?
Yeah, so this is something that actually does happen a fair amount, especially on the online feasibility questionnaires. Best way to do that is, most of the time the feasibility questionnaires have to come from someone. So it's, a project manager, maybe it's a coordinator at one of these CRO or sponsor companies. Make sure to, in your follow-up email, when you're submitting the feasibility questionnaire, check in with that person. Utilize what you would have put in the comment section in your follow-up email to those contacts. If it was an email blast and it came from it doesn't show who it came from, it just went out to your site randomly, really take a deeper look into that CRO and sponsor. See if you've worked with anybody in the past. Maybe you have a monitor you've worked with in the past that can shoot your request up the food chain. If you haven't worked with anybody, do some research. Try and find the most appropriate person, project manager that works on, the therapeutic area. So, yeah, just really utilizing your CRO sponsor contacts, making sure you send that information you would to the contact that the feasibility questionnaire came from.
Okay, great. What if it's a new site overall, but it's filled with staff consisting of clinical coordinators with 30-plus trial experience? Should the feasibility questionnaire be filled out based on the previous trial experience, even though it's not specific to that particular site?
Yeah, so this is, if it's a new clinical research site and the PI is inexperienced, it becomes a little tricky. You have to take a look at exactly what they're asking in terms of the past metrics. If it's a coordinator's past metrics, I don't think that you can put that in there. If it's maybe the sub-I has worked, or one of the other investigators worked on a trial at a different location, I would make sure that you could probably put that in there in place of the metrics. But just make sure to make that very explicitly clear. If it's asking if the site has done any before, then I would leave it blank, but try and put it somewhere else in the comments section. Mention that you have a coordinator that's worked on a few trials in the past at their other site, or our sub-I has worked on a few trials in the past at our other site, and you can always input those metrics in the comments section. They may not look as pretty, but you can still get them in there.
Okay, great. This is a suggestion actually from an attendee. Thank you, Patrick, for sending in. Just another suggestion, the drug reps that come to your site are another good way to get novice PIs connections to speak with the sponsor. Just wanted to put that out there for everyone. Okay, so how do we make overwhelmed physicians see the potential in research to help them take the plunge?
Overworked physicians. Yeah, so that does happen often where PIs think they have, they don't have enough time on their hands. And my best suggestion there would be try that lunch and learn. Maybe they've worked on, when they were a post-grad or when they were in their residency, they worked on a few innovative drugs. Maybe it'll spark something there. You can't convince the PI to abandon like what they really want to do, or the potential investigator. So the lunch and learn, just maybe they're enticed by the compensation structure. So that's something you would put forward in the lunch and learn. Maybe they'll take another look at that. Maybe they decide they can set a few hours aside. Maybe convince them to try and take on that trial period of 3 to 5 hours in the week, at your site. Maybe have them serve as a sub-I. And that will probably, maybe that'll convince them to siphon a couple hours off of their week to devote to clinical research, where they can spend a day or two eventually as a PI in the research facility.
Okay. A local IRB is mandating that all PIs in their team take the city course. How do you get them excited about this course?
The city course. Local IRB, so we actually work with mostly central IRB sites. We work with a few local IRB sites, not too many. But with that one, I would just recommend if they really want to take on this study, if you really want to get involved in this program, it's just something you have to do. I would just see if you can convince them to do it. Based on study requirements. It's just something they're going to have to do. Okay.
Now, next one. Does rejecting a study after the qualifications visit and after beginning the budgeting process create a black mark on your record?
Could you repeat that, Simone?
Sure. Does rejecting a study after the qualification visit and after beginning the budgeting process create a black mark on your record?
Not necessarily. Depending on the scenario, say you had a qualification visit and you decide you don't want to take on, say, yeah, it's a lot of time that the sponsor or CRO has spent coming out to your site, investing and seeing if you're a good fit for this. But ultimately, if you give a reason, you say, we don't think we have the time or resources to put our energy into this. We don't think we'd be able to hit the enrollment expectations. Ultimately, they're going to be happy that you didn't take that on, and because spending spending money on site startup for you to enroll for the next couple months, that will be pretty difficult. That's a bigger hole in their pocket than you not initially taking the study.
Okay, great. We do have a few questions regarding therapeutic areas and breaking into therapeutic areas. We actually did have a webinar last month presented by our colleague Riley. So I'm happy to send out that webinar to anyone who's interested, because it basically covers that topic. We also keep getting questions on the recording. The recording will be sent out within 24 hours of the presentation, so you guys can expect that in your inbox by tomorrow. I do have more questions though. Conducting site visits at dedicated sites versus novice PI patient practice. That was kind of the whole question. Is that enough for you to answer?
I think, could you repeat that? I might be able to pick it up, see what they're trying to ask.
Conducting site visits at dedicated sites versus novice PI's patient practice.
Oh, okay. I think they're trying to say what the difference is between those two. Conducting site visits at dedicated research sites versus private practices of the novice PI. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be doing the research at the dedicated research site, the PSC is going to be conducted there. Something you definitely want to bring up is, yeah, even though they're going to be performing the research, clinical research site, the PI is going to be able to pull all their patients, or not all their patients, they're going to be able to pull patients for the study from their private practice. That's a new source that they have for the site. So when you're filling out a feasibility questionnaire, to help get this PSC, the database numbers doesn't have to only include your clinical research site database. It can also include the database of the private practice of the research naive PI. So that's something to keep in mind when talking to these sponsors and CROs.
Okay, great. I know that there's a hand raised. If you have a question, feel free to ask in the question box, unless that's an accident. Okay. Next question. How open are sponsors and or CROs to the notion of including novice PIs in their trial?
So actually, I know a few companies that are actually pretty open to it. There are a lot of companies that are actually making it a point too for their trials to take on research naive PIs. I know Novartis is actually one of them. They mentioned that to us previously, that they were looking to maybe involve research naive PIs. Another advantage for sponsors and CROs using research naive PIs is the fact that they have all these resources available, all their time they can throw into it, because they haven't worked on any trials before. Especially if they're coming from working with an experienced site, they're going to know how to do. The site's going to know how clinical trials work, know how to take on studies and work on trials. So they are pretty open. I think it's definitely a trend that we have seen, that sponsors are willing to review PIs with less experience or no experience.
Okay, cool. All right. Does it matter what phase of studies a new PI starts with when entering the industry?
Say it again, Simone, sorry.
Okay, does it matter what phase of studies a new PI starts with when entering the industry?
It doesn't particularly matter, but the observational in phase 4, the reason I recommend those is they're going to be easier to obtain. Phase 2 and 3 would probably be next on that. Those are interventional studies, but typically way more competitive. Fine if a PI, we have seen PIs take on interventional phase 2, 3 studies as their first study. It's been fine. Phase 1 studies, I would say those are going to be something a research naive PI probably shouldn't take on as their first study. They tend to be highly competitive, pretty intensive procedures, and they often require that inpatient overnight stay and really highly sought after studies. So not something often that CROs and sponsors will go to for phase 1 studies. In fact, a lot of CROs have their own facilities that they conduct phase 1 studies out of. So they're going to go to those sites that they've worked with in the past, their phase 1 facilities. So I would say, aside from phase 1, the other ones are fair game.
Okay, great. Has there been any movement towards sponsors allowing psych NPs to serve as PIs?
Cite what service PIs?
NPs, I think that's an acronym for new PI, novice PI.
Yeah, there has, like I said, I think I mentioned this in a earlier question that a few sponsors are taking that approach, seeing a little bit of a trend towards that, just because, they're like someone mentioned earlier, there's these overworked physicians, there's these overworked sites, there's these overworked coordinators that have a couple trials on their hand. They would like to, sometimes they're willing to review those PIs that don't have a lot of experience and know that they can throw their full attention to it, all their resources, and especially if they have that prior experience as a sub-I, or if they're backed by a really experienced clinical research site.
Sorry, Chris, I didn't want to interrupt. So the NP was actually for nurse practitioner?
Oh, okay, nurse practitioner. Actually, I know I've received that question quite a lot recently. Haven't really seen a trend towards that. Typically, they want an MD or a DO to be running the trials. I know there's a few instances where that's been the case, but generally I haven't seen any NPs be awarded a trial as a PI.
Okay, great. All right, so this one is, how do you break into dental studies? Any experience with this, or know anyone that knows dentists doing research? That might be
dental?
An email question. How do you
dental
break
studies?
into dental studies? Yeah.
Yeah, that might be more of an email question. It depends on the therapeutic area, but yeah, that might be more of an email question we can get back to.
Okay. How do oncology studies differ from other therapeutic studies?
So oncology studies are typically require more specialized physicians. There will be oncologists that focus on particular different types of cancers. Some of the more general ones that you'll see that other PIs can work on other than oncologists would be sometimes it's breast cancer, but pretty rarely melanoma. Sometimes dermatologists can work on that, depending on the severity of it. But for the most part, cancer is very specialized, and it's going to require a very specific PI. So, if you're trying to go out and find a research investigator, I would avoid looking for an oncologist unless you're a large health system. Then you probably have oncologists on staff, and again, the market out there, it's a little more strict with oncology studies. There's not a whole lot out there just because of how specific. I mean, there's a lot out there, but it's pretty specific. So, yeah, oncology a little different in that sense.
Okay, great. We have time for just a few more.
Okay.
This one might also be an email one. Actually, yeah, we'll probably say one. Can you review any positive benefits to study sponsor for using a research naive investigator? Seems like the reverse type question from earlier.
Yeah, benefits from using a research naive investigator would be that they have the time to put into it. Their first study, they're probably going to be pretty focused on it. It's just from they especially backed by the research site. It's pretty similar to the question earlier.
Yeah. Our PI specialty is internal medicine. Is there an indication you would recommend to start out with for a novice PI?
So if you're internal medicine, in terms of our recommendations, what we saw over the last year and what's kind of forecasted for next year, if you have any neighboring gastroenterologists, that's a great area to get into right now. We've seen a lot of UC and Crohn's studies out there, less IBS, in IBS-C or CIC, seeing less of that, but tons of UC and Crohn's out there. It's an unmet need that's coming up. Seeing a lot of Alzheimer's work coming down the line as well. NASH, which, nephrologists, that would be a good area to consider. And we did see a lot of women's health last year. That may be on the decline a little bit, but it could be picking up. But if you really just, I would explore the industry trends, what you're seeing if there's any nearby physicians that are interested, or that if your often PIs have good relationships with nearby physicians. See if, maybe initially check with them, see if they have any physicians that they work with or accept referrals from that could be potentially interested in research.
Great. And we had another suggestion. Thank you, Patrick, for the sponsor. Another benefit is access to more patients, which I think you did cover early on in the presentation, but good point for the sponsor. Okay, I think we'll do one more question. So this person says, I'm in an HMO, and the new PI/sub PIs or sub-Is are expected to do research on their own time. Please share any thoughts.
From an SMO or HMO?
From an HMO? Yeah.
Yeah, that might be more something I could get back to in an email, just more extensively. Just cover that if that's okay.
All right, yeah, no, that's okay. We'll just do one more then. How do I convince a doctor that research will not negatively affect their practice?
Yeah, so often a lot of patients are excited to do research, aside from the fact that it's free healthcare. It's something pretty interesting to get into. It's a neat process to be a part of. There was some recent patient polls that showed that a lot of patients, it's not so much to do it for the money, but it's more to do it for the benefit of research. So people are interested in it, plus the added benefit of free healthcare. In terms of his patients directly, he gets to evaluate who's a good fit and who's not. Oftentimes it'll be depending on the types of medication. I've even also seen some investigators, turn down studies that are great budgets, but maybe wouldn't be the best for their patient. Maybe there's a placebo component there that they don't want their patients taking. They don't want elderly patients taking a placebo when they could be having a drug. So it allows them to be the decision makers, to review the studies, see how they think it would be for their patients. Especially if there's no placebo arm. Not necessarily saying all placebos are bad, especially in oncology studies. The placebo is typically the standard of care.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for staying. I know we went a little tiny bit over, but that is all the time that we have for our webinar today. Please look for our follow-up email. It'll alert you of the on-demand status of today's event, and you can review any materials you missed or simply go over them again. Also, please take a moment to fill out our short exit survey. We do pay close attention. We've been refining this webinar series throughout the year, and we have been getting good feedback, so that's good. But anything you think we should change or we can improve, definitely include that in the survey. So on behalf of Clinic, I want to thank you for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.